Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Online Offline. Today's discussion is centered on the legacy of the Lee Hsien Loong government. He has been in power for the past 8 years, and many aspects of his leadership will be under scrutiny today. We've decided that for the purposes of scoping the discussion, that we will focus on 3 aspects: education, manpower and immigration issues, and the third one being engagement.
The world has seen a tremendous, a huge change in terms of economic scenarios. What we have seen, emergence of economies like China and India, whereas transferred the entire manufacturing processes of the world, polarizing into those 2 countries. Now, if you look back the whole history, Singapore was based primarily started off as a manufacturing base. To cut down the high employment rate in 60s, manufacturing was the base to boost the local economy. Subsequently, what we saw, like, migration of manufacturing base from Singapore to some other countries, and, challenges faced in the country in terms of, 1997 economic crisis, subsequently by SARS, then the Gulf War, and what we saw, economic bubbles across the globe, and the most latest one in 2007, the housing bubble. If you look back the whole scenario, the challenges that we faced were tremendous, but overall, we did quite a good job. Challenges are different, and the needs of the country has been emerging over the years. And what it was seen, how do we go about the growth? Should we go straight as a turtle economy or the horse economy? Well, I'm glad the government chose to be a horse economy. Why? Because simply I felt like, if you run as a turtle economy, you don't have much of, money to sustain the social programs. We need higher growth rate that can bring in more revenue, more investments, make the economy more vibrant, and that would help in terms of the social services programs. And if you move back, we were seeing the government is not talking to anybody. They don't listen. They were increasing stress on the manpower. They were increasing immigration. There was a need to boost the growth. We needed more manpower. And that was the only way we could go into higher gear the economy. Now what happened, the government listened. I'm glad the Prime Minister opened and has put in some cabinet ministers in charge, and also the member of parliaments to go out and speak to the crowd, to the Singaporeans, get their views on issues and explain the government policies, the government stand. So it's a nicer way, and I've been encouraged to see the man on the streets coming forward, talking about a range of issues. So here we have a government who's communicating with us. They have created avenues for us to go and give the feedback, and that's such a wonderful changes. And I'm glad we have such a move by the government.
Well, I think basically what you're saying is that engagement is proceeding and it has borne fruit. But I think some people will question whether the engagement is a pretty recent affair, and whether or not the engagement is wholehearted and will result in some concrete measures. And we will see how it does with that.
I think what Shekhar has mentioned, it is quite true. The Singapore government has gone out quite strongly to engage Singaporeans, be it particularly after the general elections or as part of this, over the past 8 years, it has done that. The key thing that I really want to question is when the government does engagement, what are the core principles behind it? Because that is really going to make or break what is it that you achieve at the end of the day. I would tend to believe that it's centered around 3 core principles. One is inclusiveness, another is transparency, and the third would be what are called results or response. So I think we see this new initiative that's called the National Conversation that's going on. And a lot of goods and bads about it. Principally, I think people were also comparing it against some of the older initiatives like the Remaking Singapore initiative that took place some time back. Say what you like about sacred cows being slaughtered or not. I think let's leave that at this point in time. But let's take a look at inclusiveness. What is it that the government has really done? I think when they think of inclusiveness, there's a tendency to just look at the composition of the people that they speak to. It seems that they're believing that if you have a taxi driver, a homemaker, or a student, that's inclusive. That's not. That's actually demographics. I think when you look at inclusiveness, you need to take into account the most strident voices, the voices that are actually giving you very active feedback into how you can actually change policy. So the real question is, have that been included? If we really look at the conversations that are going on or have been going on over the past few years, I would tend to believe that not to be the case. And why would you want to do something like that? Because in all that is actually some inputs for improvement. And yes, you could be right to say that the economy is improving, but if you have measured in all these feedback as well, could it actually have been better? Would it have served Singaporeans better? Next thing is actually transparency. I think that has come under a lot of flack in terms of government being seen to be just doing closed doors, speaking to people on the side, but not really being very open about it. I think when you're talking about a new generation government, this has to come in. People want to see that things are being done and things are done openly. And it fits in the last part about feedback. So when people give suggestions, they want to see how is it they've suggested that in the policy, and we are not getting a very good feel of that. I mean, in terms of some of the initiatives that they have, things like REACH, I mean, that has really taken quite a few blows because you don't feel that it's basically a black hole. Basically, people see a black hole, just goes in, nothing really comes back out. And also, currently today, what do we have? We have the Factually portal, which is, I think, not quite there. We're still looking at a case where the government is trying to push the message out rather than do engagement. So I think that is a difference there. If you're really asking about going digital in this sense, I mean, this is a new generation of Singaporeans ready to reach out to the government. What is it that the government has done online that will basically have a more meaningful impact, taking into consideration inclusiveness, transparency, and having a results-oriented approach? I think there's still some way off. There are certain ministers who are very positive, who are very engaging, but if you just look at PM's Facebook as an example, it's still pretty much a one-way kind of affair. So all in all, I'll say that there's a lot more to be improved, and we really, what the government really needs to do is to take into account what citizens are looking for in that engagement process. It should never be one way. It has to be a two-way process. What they have fed back to the government is taken into consideration. It's considered for policy. It's just not just something that you do as part of lip service, which I think a lot of people feel to be that case right now.
What I found interesting was your point that was made about if the government had listened and engaged the people, whether or not the economic growth, the economic strategy would be different. And we would not be facing these problems of immigration and foreign labor and the manpower crunch and deciding whether to change strategy. I gather that essentially what you seem to feel, and perhaps Shekhar differs, is that the government did not listen, and therefore economic strategy is the way it is right now. And it would have changed, it would have been different, it would have been better for the rest of us if it were, if it were more open and the results of the feedback were clearly seen.
Before I talk about how we've done economically, I was hoping to say something briefly about engagement. People may know that PM Lee gave a keynote speech or landmark speech on the subject of his philosophy on engagement before he became PM to the Harvard Club in 2004. And he set out, his views and his philosophy on engagement. And if you look back at it 8 years, I think it has more or less evolved in the way that he has envisaged. I'd just like to cite a personal example, because one of the things I do is I practice tax law. And in that speech, PM Lee said that tax matters are both market sensitive and difficult to debate productively, and therefore not all policies are amenable to public consultation. So I didn't agree with that, and I wrote to the Straits Times to say, PM, you might not be right. And I of course, there was a public response saying, from MOF, and it was done by Dr. Francis Chong, who was the QSM, and I think, as you may know, he was a very active commentator himself, written many letters to the press. So the government had their response, but certainly Dr. Francis Chong engaged with me on my critique, and I think they were quite open. He acknowledged that maybe the government doesn't move in the way that I would like, but I think it was quite genuine in terms of engagement. And I've had these sort of discussions also with the tax department, MOF, putting forward ideas on consultation, for legislation. And I do think actually that if I make a rational argument, it does get considered. It doesn't always get agreed. But I think that's one example. So there's also, I think it's genuine. I think also there's no need to fear that if you say something that is different from what the government puts out, that it's going to rebound on you so long as you're trying to do it honestly and rationally. So that was kind of my own sort of experience on this engagement subject. I mean, on the topic of economic growth, I mean, the motion sort of asks whether we've had an exceptional 8 years, and of course, exceptional is very difficult to define. It's not one thing, but it's also not everything. I think no one is suggesting that the government is perfect, because no government is perfect. But I think the question is whether, on the whole, Singapore's PAP-led government has done an exemplary job. And I think that it has. And I don't know whether my friends on the opposite side will disagree, but that is one view that has been expressed before. Maybe just on the topic of economic development, I'd just like to put forward the idea that we've done very well, and I'd like to focus on two different groups of periods of years. The first one is in terms of the period from 2000 to 2005, and the period from 2006 to 2010, and how we've done in terms of boosting incomes, not just at the median, but also for the lower income Singaporeans. And figures on that were put forward by DPM Taman in this year's budget speech, and I think it's quite illustrative. So if you look at the figures for median income of households from 2001 to 2006, sorry, I got the years wrong, it was 0.7% real growth for that whole period for the median, and minus 1.7 for those at the 20th percentile. And for the next 5 years after that, it was 16.9% real growth for the median and 13.6% for the 20th percentile. So what that indicates to me is that the current administration has actually done better than before, and significantly better in generating not just economic growth, but wage growth, not just at the median, but amongst the lower income population. And I think that's a good performance. And I think the second sort of period that I'd like to look at is from 2007 to today, where the government has taken many steps to address problems like social inequality. So workfare was a quite groundbreaking scheme that was introduced in 2007 to boost incomes. I think if we look at the budget this year, it has focused tremendously on inclusiveness. I mean, even to the point that opposition MPs like Mr. Lau Tia Kiang have expressed favorable opinions of the budget. So I think both in terms of growth and in terms of addressing issues like inclusiveness, the government has done well. I think they've also done well in responding to the global financial crisis, which is a profound crisis affecting the whole world. We were hit hard, no doubt, in 2009 We recovered quickly. 2010, there was a lot of growth. So I think the economic performance has been very good, and it has not been, I submit, at the expense of looking at social problems. These things have certainly been taken into account by the government. Two other things perhaps I'd like to mention. One, I think Singapore's physical infrastructure has developed very well. I think things like gardens by the bay, the network of green corridors that we've set up, in the rail corridor, in the Round Island network, all this is great. I'm a big F1 fan, so I'm delighted that F1 came to Singapore in an iconic race, and it's going to go on for another 5 years. So I think that shows how Singapore's physical infrastructure has grown. And lastly, I think we've been safe from terrorism throughout this period, and I think that's not something to forget.
But I've noticed something in the way you put across economic growth and the social problems. You seem to put them as two discrete things, rather than how economic growth might actually be the precipitator for some of the social problems that we have. And you have put it as they've done well raising economic growth and incomes across the board, which we can't deny. But we've also seen some changes in terms of the income disparity, which is widening, and how people might say that excellent social programs like workfare is actually a response to this, to counter something that went wrong where the economic strategy is concerned. Anyway, that's my point of view, so I don't know what Sudhir will say.
Sorry. The first thing I would like to say is that I really dislike Formula One. It's the most environmentally damaging sport in the world, flying tons of equipment and cars across the world for a race. But anyway,
just quickly, I second that.
but I have many friends who love the fact that F1 is now in Singapore. I had prepared my statements more along the lines of immigration and manpower, but I'll just touch very briefly, I suppose, on the broad economic growth situation, because both of the speakers have mentioned it. I mean, one argument I would like to put forward is that a lot of the growth that we've seen in Singapore over the past decade has not really been down to anything marvelous that this administration has done. It's been Singapore's place as a very open economy in a world where we've seen China and India plugging into the global labor force, and Singapore just being in that sweet spot to take advantage of it. So, it almost seems to me that whatever administration you had there, as long as they didn't screw up big time, by virtue of the fact that Singapore is at the center of global trade routes, is at the center of supply chains, lots of multinationals coming through here, all those things put together, I'm not so sure this administration really, deserves the credit for the economic growth that we've seen over the past 10 years. And in fact, as Bertha mentioned, I know median incomes, I don't have the stats that you do, but median incomes obviously have risen over the past, your point was over the past, is it past 5 years, both at median incomes and 20th percentile have risen in the past 5 years. But I suppose, the other point is that the rate of growth of those incomes, has been greatly outstripped by the rate of growth of the higher income people at the upper ends of the income spectrum. And because of that, we've seen a huge disparity in wealth and income that we have today in this country. So, and the other thing about real incomes is that, you always have to wonder what inflation rate they use, because, there are things that are sometimes not captured by traditional inflation measures. And for me, one of the most stark things is that over the past decade, you've seen bigger and bigger chunks of Singapore. You can, and Marina Bay, the whole Marina Bay is a great example. The price of property there, the price of a coffee there, the price of having a simple lunch there. More and more parts of Singapore are simply out of reach from a cost perspective to more and more Singaporeans. And that is quite worrying. Anyway, that's just the little bit on overall economic growth. I'll come back to this issue of immigration and manpower, which I wanted to talk about. Because I think when you look at when you use the lens of immigration and manpower to look at the performance of this administration, I think you really see some, you really see in my mind some colossal failures of this administration. And first, let me start with an assumption. I'm not, the PAP has always had a fixation on high economic growth that has been dependent on foreign labor and capital. Now, I'm going to assume that this current administration could not have changed that, right? So I'm not going to argue with the fact that they brought migrants in and we needed migrants in. Let's just assume that this economic model that we've followed for the past 20, 30 years is the one that they had to follow, and so I'm not going to question that. But even if we accept that we needed this amount of migrants to sustain this amount of economic growth, even then I see two, like I said, colossal policy blunders. Now the first one has to do with coordination across ministries, right? So even if we accept that we needed this amount of migrants for this amount of economic growth, why wasn't there better coordination across ministries? I mean, and the two sectors you look at that are most pertinent are transportation and housing. Why wasn't there better coordination with the transportation sector? Why wasn't there, I mean, if you look at a very elemental level, why wasn't there planned capacity increases to take into account this inflow of migrants? And if you're going to look at a higher level, why wasn't there a questioning of the very business model of our transportation at an earlier stage? So, it's only been in the last 3 or 2 years that we've had questions asked about whether we should nationalize our transportation system, whether this sort of market-driven, MRT model that we followed is actually the right one. Second, housing, same argument, capacity, or if you're going to look at housing inflation, why weren't there better policies that would have kept housing affordable for Singaporeans? So, for example, reducing speculation amongst the foreigners. Why are foreigners allowed to buy up one entire floor of a condominium and just speculate on it? So, the first policy blunder would be coordination with other ministries. Now, the second policy blunder, and this goes back to the point of the PAP has always been, famed for its forward-looking abilities, right? But these two policy blunders show that it's actually become very myopic, and they've started reacting to situations rather than proactively thinking about them. And the second point is integration, right? So integration, in my opinion, ethnic tensions today in Singapore are the worst that I've ever seen. And when you look at ethnic tensions and xenophobia, once in a while they're separated, once in a while they're conflated. But xenophobia and racism today is at a level that I've never seen. I think the founding fathers of Singapore, one of the core tenets for Singapore was ethnic integration and multiracialism, and the situation today has almost been reversed. It's almost as if all the good work of the past 30 years has been reversed, and that has affected Singaporeans' sense of belonging and identity. And once again, it leads to a lot of question marks about Singaporean identity.
So on one hand, we have a list of achievements, and the other hand, we have colossal blunders. Well, they can't be more different than that. I'm just wondering whether or not there will be what the other two panelists have to say about the other very, very hot topic, which is education, which is right now under siege on many different fronts, or whether it should be an excellence model, or whether it should be less of an excellence and more of a holistic achievement kind of approach that Singapore should take. So, Visakan?
Okay, let me talk first about how I think most people will be in agreement that from the 70s to the 90s, our education policies were really well thought out given the context of Singapore at the time, when we had people who were unemployed, and we had we needed people who have vocational skills in the 80s and in the 70s and 80s when we just got independence from Malaysia. So during that period of time, I believe that our education policies were very rational, very sound, and we lifted people out of poverty, and we did a lot of good things. But what happens is, during that industrial model, the industrial framework of academic results, where you get the standard Singaporean idea of work hard, get the high grades, go and get the specific job. is becoming a little bit obsolete in today's more complex world. And our culture and our social ideas about what education should be have still been defined by these, what I would say are now obsolete ideas. But we have to acknowledge that they were relevant before, and we are now in that in-between stage where we are learning to adapt to what we should be like. So I will point out that, for example, in what we have been doing is the MOE has been drawing emphasis away from bending, been removing the bending thing, because, for example, the idea of a top school doesn't really make so much sense when you consider that, for example, a lower school that takes in weaker students and makes them improve by a significant amount technically adds more value than to a student than a top school that has students that are already performing very well. So our criteria and our perspectives of what makes good schools needs to change, and it is changing, and that is very nice to see. And like even at the most simple level, when you're talking about leadership, you know, like at a recent conference, PM Lee did tell parents that, you know, they need to let their children have a childhood, which I thought, you know, from a leadership perspective, it's nice to see at the very least the leaders speaking up about this kind of very basic fundamental ideas on how we should be looking at things. And I think the most, like, I criticize our education system a lot as a blogger, but I feel that our government is more or less doing what they can. Our primary problem in our education system is cultural, is people on the ground. It's when parents demand their children do well because they want to compare to each other, and they, you know, you have this crazy inflated tuition industry where, you know, like 80 to 90% of people send their kids to tuition to get academic results. That, you know, there's a whole system of inflation going on, which is, I think, very unsustainable, but I also feel that the government can't do very much about it. It's more of up to us as individuals, as a part of society, to influence cultural change. And I guess the government's role in that situation is to allow for such discourse to take place, to get out of the way and listen and take notes and see how that should inform policy. And I think they have been doing that.